After my husband died, my in-laws took everything and kicked me out. They laughed when I begged for my kids' share. Until the court summoned them, revealing my husband had secretly signed over everything to me before his death. My world ended with laughter. Not the kind that warms a home, but the cruel, sharp-edged laughter of those who had just stolen everything from me. I stood in the courtyard, barefoot, my feet sinking into the cold, damp earth. Smoke curled into the night sky, thick and black, carrying the scent of burning fabric and paper. My life reduced to ashes. My children clung to me, their tiny fingers digging into my dress, their silent sobs shaking their small bodies. Behind us, my in-laws watched the fire as though it were a festival, their faces lit with twisted satisfaction. "There," Elizabeth sneered, tossing another handful of my clothes into the flames. "That should take care of any delusions she had about coming back." Her words hit me harder than the chilly air pressing against my skin. Coming back. I had never even left. This was my home, the place I had built with my husband, the place where I had nursed fevers, cooked countless meals and rocked my babies to sleep. Not anymore. "Leave," Christopher spat, his voice cold and final. "You have no right to be here." I turned to him, my throat burning with unshed tears. No right. This was my home. My children's home. But I knew pleading would do nothing. I had seen it in their eyes the moment my husband Andrew took his last breath. His death had freed them not from grief but from me. They had never truly accepted me. Oh, they had worn polite smiles at first, treating me with the bare minimum of civility when Andrew was alive. But his presence had been the only shield protecting me. Now that he was gone, I was nothing more than an unwanted outsider in their eyes. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to remain steady. "At least give me my children's share. You cannot take everything." That was when they laughed. All of them. The men, the women, even the servants who had once bowed their heads in my presence. As if I had just uttered the most ridiculous joke. "Her children's share?" One of the men scoffed, stepping forward with a smirk. "Listen to her. As if she ever had any claim to anything here." Another roar of laughter followed. I felt my stomach turn. How had it come to this? How had the people I once called family become my worst nightmare? "Your husband is dead," Elizabeth said, her eyes narrowing with triumph. "That means you are nothing. A widow with no name, no power, no rights." I flinched at her words. Nothing. That was what they saw me as now. Not a wife who had loved and cared for their son. Not the mother of his children. Just a nobody. I clenched my fists, trying to push down the anger rising inside me. "You can't do this. The law. The law." Christopher, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was thick with amusement, but beneath it there was steel. "What law, girl? In this house we make our own rules." And just like that I understood. There was no reasoning with them. No law that would save me here, no justice waiting around the corner. They had already decided my fate, long before Andrew had even been buried. "You can leave with whatever you're wearing," he continued, crossing his arms. "That's more than you deserve." I opened my mouth to protest, but before I could utter a word, I felt a hard shove against my back. The force sent me stumbling forward, nearly falling. I caught myself just in time, my knees scraping against the rough ground. My children gasped in fear, clutching at me as though they knew, if I fell now, I might never get back up. I turned my head, my heart pounding. One of the men, the one who had just pushed me, grinned down at me. "Oops," he said mockingly. "Careful. Wouldn't want you to get hurt." A fresh wave of humiliation burned through me. Not just the cruelty but the enjoyment they took from it. I wanted to scream, to curse them, to demand they look me in the eye and remember all the times I had cooked for them, celebrated their successes, cared for them when they were ill. But I knew it wouldn't matter. To them I was nothing but an inconvenience they were finally rid of. Tears burned at the back of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not in front of them. Not when they were waiting for me to break. I reached for my children, gathering them close. Their small faces were streaked with tears, their eyes wide with fear. They didn't understand why the people they had once called family were doing this. I took a deep breath. I had to be strong for them. Slowly I pushed myself up, ignoring the pain, ignoring the taunts, ignoring the smoke rising from what had once been my life. Without another word, I turned away from the house that had been my home, the house that had held all my memories, the house that had been stolen from me in the cruelest way possible. My legs felt like lead as I took the first step. Then another. Then another. No one stopped me. No one called me back. Behind me the fire crackled, consuming everything I had ever owned. And my in-laws, they kept laughing. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know how I would survive. All I knew was that I was leaving behind a world that had betrayed me in the worst way. But as I stepped into the cold night, my children's hands gripping mine, something inside me hardened. They thought they had won. They thought they had destroyed me. But they had no idea what was coming. I would fight. I would rise. And one day they would regret ever thinking I was weak. The cold night air bit into my skin as I stepped away from the burning remnants of my past. My children, their small hands gripping mine like lifelines, walked beside me, their quiet sniffles breaking the silence. The weight of what had just happened sat heavy in my chest, pressing down with every breath. I had no home. No money. No plan. Only my children, my will to survive, and the clothes on my back. The streets were empty, silent except for the distant hum of passing cars. My feet ached, but I kept moving, afraid that if I stopped, the despair clawing at my insides would consume me whole. "Where are we going, Mama?" My daughter, Emily, looked up at me, her voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard, pushing down the lump in my throat. "Somewhere safe, my love. Somewhere safe. But where?" I thought about knocking on a relative's door, but I already knew how that would go. I had no family of my own, and my husband's relatives had made their stance clear. To them I was nothing now, just a burden. As we turned the corner onto a quieter street, I spotted a dimly lit bench near a closed shop. My legs screamed for rest, and I finally allowed myself to collapse onto the cold, hard surface, pulling my children close. For a moment I let the exhaustion take over. The reality of our situation was suffocating. My in-laws had taken everything, our home, our security, our dignity, and they had done it with laughter. Tears burned at the back of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't change anything. "Are we sleeping here?" My son Jacob whispered, his voice laced with uncertainty. I hesitated, hating that I didn't have a better answer. "Just for a little while." Emily shivered beside me, pressing closer for warmth. I wrapped my arms around them both, trying to shield them from the night's chill. I had to figure something out. Fast. Hours passed. The night stretched on endlessly. My children eventually dozed off against me, their breaths soft and uneven. But sleep refused to claim me. I couldn't stop thinking about my husband, Andrew, about the life we had built, about the betrayal that had left me sitting here on this freezing bench, homeless and alone. And then a thought struck me. The lawyer. My husband's lawyer had always been a kind man. He had been there when we signed our house papers, when we set up our children's savings accounts, when Andrew handled business deals. If there was anyone who could tell me what my rights were, it was him. The only problem? I had no way to contact him. No phone. No money for transport. Nothing. The thought made my stomach sink. I glanced at my sleeping children, their small faces peaceful despite everything. I couldn't let them wake up to this nightmare again. I had to try something. Taking a deep breath, I carefully untangled myself from them and stood up. My body protested, aching from exhaustion, but I forced myself to move. There was a small cafe across the street, its neon sign flickering weakly in the dark. It was closed, but I could see an elderly man inside, stacking chairs. I hesitated only for a second before walking toward the glass door and knocking lightly. The man turned, frowning at me through the glass. I saw his eyes flicker down to my clothes, dusty, wrinkled, out of place for the neighborhood. For a moment I thought he would ignore me, but then with a sigh he unlocked the door. "We're closed," he said, his voice gruff. "I know," I said quickly. I hesitated, swallowing my pride. "I need to make a phone call. Please. It's urgent." He raised an eyebrow. "You got money?" Shame burned through me. "No," I admitted. "But I have children out there and my voice cracked. I just need to call someone who can help us." His gaze softened slightly. He studied me for a long moment before sighing and stepping aside. "One call," he muttered. "And be quick about it." Relief flooded me. "Thank you," I whispered, stepping inside. The warmth of the cafe hit me immediately, making me realize just how cold I had been outside. But I didn't have time to dwell on it. The man handed me a phone and with shaking fingers, I dialed the lawyer's office number, praying he would answer. The line rang. Once, twice, then a voice. "This is Michael Carter." For a moment I couldn't speak. The weight of everything that had happened crashed down on me, making it hard to form words. "Hello," he said again, his tone more alert this time. I took a deep breath. "Mr. Carter, it's me. Olivia." There was silence. Then a sharp inhale. "Olivia." He sounded shocked. "What? Where are you?" I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my voice steady. "I have nowhere to go. They took everything. They kicked me out." A long pause. Then his voice turned firm. "Tell me where you are." I glanced around, giving him the name of the street. "Stay there," he said. "I'm coming." The call ended, and for the first time in hours, a sliver of hope flickered inside me. I returned to my children, pulling them close once more. The night felt less suffocating now, the weight on my chest slightly lighter. It wasn't over. I wasn't defeated yet. Half an hour later, a black car pulled up to the curb. The driver's door swung open and Michael Carter stepped out, his eyes scanning the street until they landed on me. He looked different from the last time I had seen him. Older, wearier. But his expression softened when he saw my children sleeping beside me. Without a word, he took off his coat and draped it over them. "Come," he said quietly. "Let's get you somewhere safe." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Carefully, I lifted my children and followed him toward the car. As I settled into the seat, watching the city blur past the window, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't alone anymore. And no matter what it took, I was going to get back everything that had been stolen from me. I sat at Michael Carter's desk long after our conversation ended, my fingers tracing the edges of the documents Andrew had left behind. The weight of what they represented settled deep in my chest. This was my proof. My weapon. My justice. And yet, I knew it wasn't enough to simply have it. I had to be smart. Christopher and Elizabeth had already shown they were willing to do anything. Lie, steal, forge documents, to get what they wanted. If I made one wrong move, they would twist the narrative, paint me as a desperate widow grasping at something that didn't belong to me. I wasn't going to let that happen. I turned to Michael, who was reviewing a stack of legal files. "What do we do first?" He looked up, his expression unreadable. "We gather evidence. Solid, irrefutable proof. You have the real documents, but we need more." I frowned. "More?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Think, Olivia. They didn't just steal from you. They committed fraud. They must have left a trail. Fake signatures, bank transfers, witnesses who were bribed." I swallowed, realization dawning on me. If we could expose their deception, it wouldn't just be about reclaiming what was mine. They could be held accountable for their crimes. A new fire ignited in me. Where do we start? Michael wasted no time. The next morning, he called in a favor from an old colleague, a retired forensic accountant named Richard Wells. When Richard arrived at the office, he looked me over carefully, his sharp eyes scanning my face as if assessing whether I was strong enough for what lay ahead. "You're going up against powerful people," he said bluntly. "Are you ready for that?" I lifted my chin. They should be asking themselves if they're ready for me. A slow, approving smile crossed his lips. "Good answer." We spent hours going through financial records, tracking suspicious withdrawals and sudden property transfers. Christopher and Elizabeth had been careful, but they weren't perfect. There were gaps. Inconsistencies. Money that had vanished into thin air just weeks after Andrew's death. "This is enough to raise questions," Richard murmured, circling a series of transactions. "If we dig deeper, we might find out where this money actually went." My stomach churned. What if they paid off people to make sure I had no way to fight back? Michael nodded. "That's likely. But if we can prove bribery, it'll turn the case against them." It wasn't just about taking back my home anymore. This was war. I knew Christopher and Elizabeth. They thrived on power, control, and secrecy. But they weren't invincible. Someone in their circle knew the truth. And that someone could be their downfall. "I need to talk to the house staff," I said suddenly, looking up from the files. Michael frowned. "What?" "The people who worked for them. They saw everything." He hesitated. "Olivia, they might be too scared to talk." I knew he was right. Christopher ruled his house like a kingdom, and the servants were mere pawns. easily discarded if they stepped out of line. But fear had a way of shifting once people realized the power they were protecting was crumbling. They owe them no loyalty, I said firmly. And if they saw how I was treated, they might be willing to help. Michael exhaled, considering my words. Then finally he nodded. It's worth a try. 2 days later I stood outside my old home. It felt strange seeing it from the outside, like staring at a place I once knew in another lifetime. I spotted Margaret, the housemaid, stepping out the back door with a bag of trash. My heart pounded. This was my chance. I waited until she was a few feet away before stepping into her view. She froze, her eyes widening in shock. "Miss Olivia," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "You can't be here." "I just need to talk," I said quickly. "Please. I know you saw what happened. I know you know the truth." She hesitated, shifting on her feet. "They forged the documents, Margaret," I pressed. "They stole everything. And they won't stop unless someone speaks out." Her lips parted, fear flickering in her eyes. They made me sign something," she admitted in a hushed voice. "I didn't understand it at the time, but—" "What did you sign?" She swallowed hard. "A statement. Saying your husband wanted the inheritance to go to his family." My breath caught. "Do you still have a copy?" She nodded hesitantly. "I took one. Just in case." Hope surged inside me. "Margaret, if you help me, you'll be protected. But I need that paper." She looked around one last time before reaching into her apron pocket. My heart nearly stopped when she pulled out a folded piece of paper and pressed it into my hands. "Be careful, Miss Olivia," she whispered. "They won't go down without a fight." I squeezed her hand. "Neither will I." Back at Michael's office, I unfolded the paper with shaking hands. The moment I saw the forged signature at the bottom, my entire body went numb. "They really did it," I breathed. Michael leaned over my shoulder, his expression dark. "This is exactly what we needed. The final piece of the puzzle. The forged document, the financial inconsistencies, and now a witness willing to testify." "They thought they covered their tracks," I murmured. "But they left a trail of evidence behind." Richard nodded. "And now we have enough to bring them down." A slow, determined smile spread across my face. "They stole my life," I said quietly. "Now I'm going to take it back." I held the forged document in my hands, my pulse hammering in my ears. This was it. The proof of their deception. The key to unraveling everything they had stolen from me. Christopher and Elizabeth had buried me in grief, stripped me of everything I had, and laughed while doing it. But now the cracks in their foundation were about to shatter. I looked at Michael Carter, who was studying the paper with a careful, measured expression. "This is exactly what we needed," he murmured. "The moment we present this, their whole scheme falls apart." "Not yet," I said, my voice steady but firm. "They've spent years manipulating people, building their influence. If we attack too soon, they'll use their connections to bury this just like they buried me." Michael gave me a long look before nodding. "You're right. We need to control the narrative before they do." And that was exactly what we were going to do. The next morning we met with Richard Wells again, this time in a quiet cafe far from prying eyes. He brought his laptop, tapping away as he pulled up bank records, comparing them to the false documents. "They moved large sums of money right before the will was read," he said, tilting the screen toward me. Almost like they knew what was coming. A slow smile curled on my lips. They hadn't just forged documents. They had stolen money that wasn't even theirs yet. "If this information gets out, they won't just be guilty of fraud," I said, my mind racing. "They'll be exposed as thieves in front of everyone who ever respected them." Michael nodded, already seeing where I was going with this. "We leak it strategically. If people start talking about the financial inconsistencies first, it'll create doubt before we even present the forged will." Richard smirked. "I have a few contacts in the business world. I can make sure this reaches the right ears." And so we planted the first seed. Within days, rumors began swirling. At first they were subtle. Questions. Doubts. People who had once sung Christopher and Elizabeth's praises started second-guessing their loyalty. "Did you hear about the sudden transfer of funds?" "I heard something was off about the will." They were always secretive, but this is different. It was a slow drip of poison into the empire they had built. And the more the whispers spread, the more paranoid they became. Then one evening my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. They know someone is digging. They're panicking. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I had no idea who had sent the message, but one thing was clear. They were starting to feel the walls closing in. It didn't take long for Christopher and Elizabeth to react. They tried damage control, spinning their own version of the story. A friend of theirs, a well-known businessman, suddenly began praising them online, calling them pillars of the community and generous benefactors. A few journalists, ones I suspected had been paid off, released articles painting me as the bitter widow, desperate to cling to wealth that was never mine. It was calculated, well orchestrated, but it reeked of desperation. And then they made their first mistake. In an attempt to discredit me, they released a statement claiming the money transfers had been legitimate business transactions. They backed this up with false documents, banking on the fact that no one would investigate further. What they didn't realize, we already had proof of their fraud. The moment they issued that statement, Richard cross-checked it with the real financial records and immediately found discrepancies. Their story wasn't just false, it was contradictory. They just dug their own grave, Richard said with a smirk, clicking away at his laptop. Now we hit back. I had kept quiet long enough. Using our collected evidence, we reached out to unbiased journalists. Ones who weren't bought, ones who cared about the truth. Within days, articles flooded news sites. Fraud allegations surface against well-known business family. Suspicious money transfers and forged documents. A scandal unfolds. Was a widow denied her rightful inheritance? My in-laws, once untouchable, were now under a microscope. People began questioning them publicly. Clients started pulling out of deals. Business partners hesitated, not wanting to be associated with scandal. And just when they thought it couldn't get worse, social media took over. Their once pristine image crumbled overnight. And that was when I knew they were truly afraid. Late one evening, I received an unexpected visitor. It was Christopher's son, my brother-in-law. The same man who had shoved me out of my home. The same man who had laughed as my things burned. He stood outside Michael Carter's house, looking less confident than I had ever seen him. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice lacking the arrogance I had once hated. I folded my arms. "Talk? Now you want to talk?" He exhaled sharply. "Olivia, listen, things are getting out of hand. The family is under a lot of pressure." I tilted my head. "And whose fault is that?" He clenched his jaw. "You don't have to do this. We can find a solution." A bitter laugh escaped me. "A solution? Like when you took everything and threw me and my children onto the street? Like when you forged my husband's will?" He had the audacity to look guilty. We didn't think it would come to this," he admitted. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "You thought I would stay quiet. That I would break. That I would just disappear." Silence. Then finally his shoulders sagged. "What do you want?" I stared at him, a storm of emotions swirling inside me. What do I want? Justice. Revenge. My dignity. But more than anything, I wanted them to pay. And they would. I took a deep breath and met his gaze. "I want everything that was stolen from me." His face paled. He knew what was coming. And for the first time, it wasn't me who was afraid. My brother-in-law's face paled at my words, but I didn't flinch. Christopher and Elizabeth had mocked me, discarded me, and now, when they saw the noose tightening around their necks, they wanted mercy? I had none left to give. The court date was set. The day I had been waiting for. The day I would finally face them, not as the helpless widow they had thrown onto the street, but as the woman who had fought, endured, and won. The morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the mirror, staring at the reflection of the woman I had become. My face was sharper, my eyes no longer filled with grief but with determination. I adjusted my simple black blazer, smoothing out the creases of my neatly pressed clothes. A voice interrupted my thoughts. "You're ready," Michael Carter said as he entered the room. I turned to face him, my nerves tightly coiled inside me. "I have to be." He smiled slightly. "You don't have to be afraid anymore, Olivia." I exhaled, shaking off the last of my hesitation. "I'm not." We left the house together, walking toward the waiting car. Emily and Jacob watched from the doorway, their small faces filled with quiet hope. I gave them a reassuring nod before stepping inside. The ride to the courthouse was silent. the weight of the day pressing heavily on my shoulders. As we approached, the massive building loomed ahead, its grand columns standing tall, a symbol of justice. Today was my battlefield. The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the back rows, their cameras flashing as I stepped inside. Spectators whispered among themselves, eager to witness the unraveling of a once powerful family. And then I saw them. Christopher and Elizabeth sat in the defendant's section, their expressions a mixture of arrogance and barely concealed anxiety. Elizabeth had chosen to dress in mourning colors, trying to play the grieving matriarch. Christopher's son, the same man who had come to me days ago, avoided my gaze. But Christopher? He still held his head high as if he believed he would walk away untouched. I took my seat beside Michael, my spine straight, my hands folded in my lap. I would not be intimidated. The judge entered and the room fell silent. It had begun. The prosecution started strong, laying out the foundation of the case. Michael Carter presented the original documents, the will my husband Andrew had signed transferring everything to me. This is the legally binding testament of the deceased, he stated firmly. It was drawn up and witnessed before his passing. He handed copies to the judge, who studied them with careful eyes. Then he moved on to the fraud. We have undeniable proof that the defendants forged a fraudulent will to seize control of the assets, Michael continued, passing another set of documents forward. These signatures were falsified, and financial records indicate unauthorized transfers of large sums of money shortly after the plaintiff was forced out of her home. A hush fell over the courtroom. Then my in-law's lawyer stood. A man with a polished suit and a voice trained to twist words. The defense maintains that my clients acted in accordance with the wishes of the deceased, he argued. Any discrepancies in documentation were unintentional errors, not criminal acts. Unintentional errors? I clenched my fists beneath the table. But Michael, unfazed, leaned forward. We have a witness, he said. And the moment those words left his lips, I saw Christopher tense. Margaret, the housemaid, stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she took her oath. She glanced at me briefly before turning to the judge. Tell us what you saw, Michael prompted gently. Her voice was soft but steady. After Mr. Andrew passed away, I overheard conversations in the study. They were discussing changing the will. The room stiffened. She continued, her voice growing stronger. I was asked to sign a document I didn't understand. Later I saw the new will, but I remember what the real one looked like. This wasn't it. The defense lawyer stood, attempting to discredit her. You're just a housemaid. How can we trust your memory? Michael didn't even hesitate. Because we have more than memory. We have physical proof. He turned toward the screens where a forensic expert presented his findings. The signatures on the falsified will do not match those on the legitimate document, the expert explained. Additionally, ink testing indicates that the fraudulent document was created after the original, despite being dated earlier. The judge's gaze darkened. I saw Christopher's grip on the table tighten. Elizabeth's face turned ghostly pale. The truth was sinking in, and they knew it. Then came the final blow. Michael Carter presented the bank statements. Transactions showing stolen money funneled into personal accounts, land sold under fraudulent ownership, financial trails leading back to them. The judge turned to Christopher. What do you have to say for yourself? For the first time I saw him struggle for words. His arrogance faltered. His lawyer whispered furiously in his ear, but he couldn't mask the truth anymore. Silence stretched. And then he snapped. This is nonsense, he barked, slamming his hands on the table. She was never part of this family. Everything belonged to us. She was lucky we even let her stay as long as we did. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. His lawyer visibly paled. And just like that, the mask fell. They had tried so hard to paint me as the liar, the gold digger, the undeserving widow. But in their arrogance they revealed their own cruelty. The judge's gavel struck the sound block, silencing the chaos. His expression was unreadable, but his next words changed everything. This court finds the defendants guilty of fraud, financial misconduct, and willful deception. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. The original will stands. All stolen assets will be returned to the rightful owner, Olivia Bennett. I felt my body go still. I had won. The past months of suffering, humiliation, and fighting against the odds. It had all led to this moment. My in-laws lost everything. They had stolen my home, my dignity, my security. No. They were left with nothing. The courtroom's final verdict echoed in my ears long after the judge's gavel struck down. Guilty. That single word sealed their fate. Christopher and Elizabeth had spent years cloaked in wealth and influence, believing themselves untouchable. Now their empire crumbled beneath the weight of their own deception. I stood still, my heart pounding as murmurs filled the room. Reporters scrambled to type their headlines. Spectators whispered amongst themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others smirking at the long-overdue downfall of a family that had once commanded fear and respect. And then there was them, Christopher and Elizabeth, frozen in place, their faces drained of color. Elizabeth clutched the arm of her eldest son, her lips moving soundlessly as if still trying to process what had just happened. Christopher, who had carried himself with such arrogance, sat stiffly, his fingers twitching as he stared ahead, unwilling to meet my gaze. But I wasn't looking for his acknowledgement. I had already won. As the court officers moved in to handle the legal formalities, my in-law's lawyer, the same man who had so confidently defended their lies, frantically whispered in Christopher's ear. I watched as the old man's lips pressed into a tight line before he stood, his movements slow, defeated. Then, for the first time since the trial began, he turned to me, his eyes burning with a mix of fury and humiliation. For a fleeting moment, I thought he might speak, might try to salvage the last shreds of his dignity. Instead he scoffed, shaking his head. "You think you've won?" His voice was quieter than usual but no less sharp. "This family built everything from nothing. We were powerful long before you came along, and we will rise again." I tilted my head, holding his gaze steadily. "That's the difference between us," I said, my voice steady. "I never needed to destroy someone else to build a life." His nostrils flared, but before he could respond, the court officials moved forward, urging them toward the exit. The weight of their loss had only just begun sinking in, but I knew it would crush them soon enough. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. One by one, my in-laws' assets were seized, their bank accounts frozen. The lavish lifestyle they had spent years curating vanished overnight. The house they had so gleefully thrown me out of, confiscated. The luxury cars, the vacation homes, the business shares they had stolen, gone. Every piece of wealth they had amassed, most of it through manipulation and deceit, was stripped away, leaving them to face the harsh reality they had never prepared for. I heard whispers of what happened behind closed doors. Christopher, once respected, now begged old friends to help him, only to be met with rejection. No one wanted to be associated with a disgraced family. Elizabeth, who had paraded her riches like a queen, found herself isolated. The very women she had looked down upon refused to take her calls. The invitations that once flooded her doorstep stopped coming. And Christopher's son, the man who had shoved me, laughed at my pain, was left scrambling for a way to rebuild. But there was no rebuilding from this. Everything they had stolen was returned to its rightful place. To me. One evening as I sat in my home, a soft knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. Michael Carter had warned me that they might try to reach out, but I never expected it would happen so soon. When I opened the door, I wasn't surprised to see Christopher's son standing there. But what did surprise me? How different he looked. The confidence, the arrogance, it was gone. His suit was no longer tailored to perfection, his hair no longer neatly combed. He looked like a man who had lost everything. I crossed my arms. "Why are you here?" He exhaled sharply. I needed to see you." I said, nothing, waiting. A bitter smile flickered across his face. "I suppose you're enjoying this. Watching us fall apart." I studied him for a long moment before answering. "No," I said simply. "I never wanted this. But I fought for what was mine. You lost because you tried to steal from me." His jaw tightened. "I was just following what my parents wanted." I let out a humorless laugh. "And where did that get you?" He looked away, guilt flashing across his face. I know there's no fixing what we did. But my mother, my father, they're struggling. They have nowhere to go." I inhaled deeply, weighing my next words carefully. "You mean like how I had nowhere to go? Like how my children and I were thrown into the streets?" His shoulders slumped. "I'm not asking for money, Olivia. Just..." He hesitated, running a hand down his face. Just a chance to make things right. For the first time in months, I saw something real in his expression. Regret. And maybe, just maybe, a shred of humanity. I could have slammed the door in his face. I could have told him to suffer the way I had. But instead I simply said, "That's not my burden anymore." Then I closed the door. That night I sat by the window watching the city lights flicker in the distance. I had spent so long fighting, surviving. And now, I could finally breathe. Emily and Jacob slept peacefully in their beds, safe in the home that was rightfully theirs. There were no more cold nights, no more uncertainty. I had won. Not just in the courtroom but in a way that mattered far more. I had taken back my life. And as for my in-laws, they were left with nothing but the consequences of their own greed. The silence of the night was different now. No longer the silence of loneliness, despair, or uncertainty. It was peaceful. The kind of silence that came after a storm, when the winds had settled and the debris had been cleared. I sat by the window, watching the city stretch beyond the horizon. Lights flickered in distant buildings, life moving forward as it always did. But for the first time in months, I wasn't just surviving. I was free. The house was mine again, not just in legal terms but in spirit. The air inside no longer carried the weight of cruelty, of whispered schemes. It was filled with warmth, with laughter, with the soft breaths of my sleeping children. And I had fought for this. I had earned this. But as much as I had won, there was something else I had gained: clarity. The morning after my final conversation with my brother-in-law, I woke up feeling lighter. The past months had been consumed by battle, by fighting for what was rightfully mine. But now, for the first time, there was nothing left to fight. I walked through the house, my fingertips grazing the walls, remembering how different it had once been. The day I was thrown out, I had felt like an intruder in my own home. Now I reclaimed every corner. In the kitchen I found Emily standing on her tiptoes, struggling to pour milk into a glass. She turned, her bright eyes lighting up when she saw me. "Good morning, Mama," she chirped. I smiled. "Good morning, my love." She frowned in concentration as she carefully placed the glass on the counter. "Are we staying here forever now?" I knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yes," I said softly. "This is our home and no one will ever take it from us again." She grinned, wrapping her small arms around my neck. I held her close, inhaling the scent of her shampoo, her warmth pressing against me. This was what I had fought for. Later that afternoon I found myself outside the old family business, the one my in-laws had run into the ground. It was strange standing there. Months ago I had been a widow with nothing, humiliated, desperate, with no one to turn to. Now I was the legal owner of everything they had once controlled. Michael Carter had advised me to sell it, to sever all ties to that part of my past. But something held me back. I stepped inside. The office was quieter than I remembered. Most of the employees had already left, the damage of my in-laws' fraud sending waves of panic through their once loyal workforce. A few turned, their eyes widening when they saw me. "Miss Bennett," an older employee greeted, his voice unsure. "Are you here to take over?" I finished for him. "Yes." He swallowed, nodding stiffly. "We didn't know if you'd come back." I gave him a small, knowing smile. Neither did I. But here I was. In the weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding, not just the business but my life. My in-laws had ruled through fear, through manipulation. That wasn't who I wanted to be. I visited the staff personally, ensuring they weren't punished for the mistakes of their former employers. Some were guilty of aiding in their schemes, but others had simply been caught in the crossfire, too afraid to speak up. For the first time in years, the business ran on fairness. And it flourished. Word spread quickly: Olivia Bennett had returned, not as the victim but as the leader. And people respected that. I never reached out to my in-laws after that day. But I heard the whispers. Christopher had tried to appeal the case, only to be laughed out of court. No lawyer wanted to be associated with a man who had forged his own son's will. Elizabeth had disappeared from social circles, unable to face the humiliation of her downfall. And Christopher's son? He had taken a job far beneath the lifestyle he once boasted about. The arrogance, the cruelty, it had all faded in the face of desperation. For a brief moment I wondered if I should feel pity. But then I remembered how they had thrown my children and me onto the streets without a second thought. Well, they had earned their fate. One evening I found myself standing at my husband's grave. The cemetery was quiet, the air still. I traced my fingers over his name, my heart heavy with everything he had missed. They tried, I whispered, my voice barely audible. They tried to erase me, to take away everything you left behind. But I fought back. A tear slipped down my cheek, but it wasn't one of sadness. I wish you had told me, I continued. I wish you had prepared me for what was coming. But maybe you knew that I had to find my strength on my own. I knelt, pressing my palm against the cool stone. They lost, I murmured. And I won't waste my life being angry at them anymore. I have too much to live for. The wind rustled through the trees as if carrying my words away. And in that moment I felt lighter. That night, as I tucked my children into bed, Jacob looked up at me with wide eyes. Are you happy now, Mama? His question made me pause. Happiness. It had been a distant dream for so long. But now. I smiled, smoothing his hair. Yes, my love. I am. And for the first time I truly meant it. Because happiness wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about winning a court case or watching my enemies fall. It was about starting over. Rebuilding. Living. I had walked through the fire, through betrayal, through loss. And I had emerged stronger. Wiser. Unbreakable. This was my life. And no one would ever take it from me again. This was my journey. One of betrayal, loss, and the fight to reclaim what was stolen from me. But in the end, I didn't just win a court case. I won my life back. I proved that no matter how cruel the world can be, resilience will always triumph over greed. If my story moved you, if you've ever faced injustice and had to stand alone, let's make sure no one else suffers in silence. Like, share, and comment below. Tell me your thoughts, your experiences, or just let me know you're here. And if you want more stories of strength, justice, and triumph, subscribe now and turn on the notifications. Because in this world, the ones who fight back are the ones whose story. I was diagnosed with early-stage dementia. My son said, "Time to take the keys and the control." He changed my locks, threw away my journals, and erased my memories, one item at a time. But he forgot one thing: I was still his mother. And mothers remember, if not with mind, then with heart. When they finally listened to mine, his version didn't stand a chance. I was standing in my kitchen, staring at my car keys dangling from Nick's fingers, when I realized my own son had just stolen my freedom. Not borrowed. Not temporarily taken. Stolen. "Mom, you nearly drove through Mrs. Patterson's fence yesterday," he said, his voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd been hearing more often lately. "The keys stay with me now." But that wasn't true. I remembered yesterday perfectly. I'd backed out of my driveway, noticed Mrs. Patterson waving from her garden, and drove to the grocery store without incident. The fence story was fabricated, and we both knew it. My name is Sydney Hartwell, and 3 weeks ago, everything changed with 4 words from Dr. Morrison: early-stage cognitive decline. Not the full dementia sentence I'd feared, but enough to crack open the foundation of my carefully constructed life. I was 67, a retired English teacher who'd spent 42 years molding young minds, and suddenly I felt like clay in someone else's hands. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd taught thousands of students to question everything, to read between the lines, to recognize manipulation in literature. Yet here I stood, watching my 38-year-old son manipulate the narrative of my own life with surgical precision. "Nick, I don't need," I began, but Allison's perfectly manicured hand touched his shoulder, cutting me off mid-sentence. "Sydney, sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with artificial concern, "Nick's just looking out for you. We both are." The way she said "we" made my stomach clench. They'd been married only 8 months, and already she spoke as if she'd earned the right to make decisions about my life. I studied my son's face, searching for the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who'd cried in my arms when his father died, who'd called me his best friend during his college graduation speech. That boy was gone, replaced by this stranger wearing expensive clothes I couldn't afford on my teacher's pension. "Where are my photo albums?" I asked suddenly, remembering how I'd searched for them that morning. I wanted to show my neighbor the pictures from Nick's wedding, the ones where he actually smiled instead of checking his phone. Nick and Allison exchanged a look. One of those married couple telepathic conversations that excluded everyone else in the room. "You put them somewhere safe, remember?" Nick said. "You've been misplacing things lately." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I doubted myself. Had I moved them? The uncertainty felt like quicksand beneath my feet. I want to call Dr. Morrison, I said, reaching for the phone. I want to understand exactly what he told you about my condition. Mom, you were there. You heard everything he said. Nick's patience was thinning, revealing something harder underneath. Early-stage dementia. Memory issues. Potential safety concerns. He said cognitive decline, not dementia, I corrected, surprised by the steel in my own voice. Allison laughed. A sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. Sweetie, those are just different words for the same thing. But they weren't. I'd spent my entire career understanding the power of precise language, the difference between suggest and insist, between possible and probable. Dr. Morrison had been careful with his words, explaining that my symptoms were mild, that many people lived independently for years with similar conditions. The realization hit me like ice water. They weren't protecting me. They were positioning me. I walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the garden where I'd spent the morning planting tomatoes. My hands were still dirty from the soil, my back ached pleasantly from the work, and my mind felt sharp as a blade. Whatever was happening to my memory, I wasn't helpless. Not yet. I'm making coffee, I announced, moving toward the cabinet where I kept my good cups, the ones Caleb had given me for our 20th anniversary. The cabinet was empty. Where are my dishes? The question came out sharper than I intended. We put them somewhere safer, Allison said quickly. In case you drop them. My hands weren't shaking. My reflexes were fine. I'd never dropped those cups in 27 years of marriage or 15 years of widowhood. But somehow in the 3 weeks since my diagnosis, I'd apparently become too fragile to handle my own belongings. I turned around slowly, studying their faces. Nick looked uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes. Allison wore that same half-smile I was beginning to recognize. The expression of someone winning a game the other person didn't know they were playing. I want you both to leave, I said quietly. Mom, don't be ridiculous, Nick said, but his voice cracked slightly. We're trying to help you. Help me what? Disappear. The question hung in the air like smoke. I could see Nick wrestling with something, guilt maybe, or the remnants of the love we'd once shared. For a moment I thought I saw my real son flickering behind his eyes. Then Allison stepped closer to him, her presence like a shadow swallowing light. Sydney, you're getting confused again, she said, her voice gentle as a knife between ribs. Why don't you rest? We'll finish organizing things while you nap. Organizing. The euphemism made my teeth ache. I looked at Nick one more time, really looked at him, memorizing his face. Not because I might forget it due to my condition, but because I had the terrible feeling that the son I'd raised, the one who'd held my hand at his father's funeral, who'd thanked me for never giving up in his high school yearbook, might already be gone. Get out, I said, each word clear as crystal. Both of you. Now. They left, but I heard Nick's key turning in the lock from outside. A lock I'd apparently forgotten he had duplicates made for, though I couldn't remember giving permission for that either. Standing alone in my kitchen, I realized that my diagnosis hadn't shaken my world. My son had. The silence after they left felt different, heavier, like the air before a storm. I walked through rooms that had sheltered me for 32 years and nothing felt familiar anymore. The walls held the same paint, the floors creaked in the same places, but something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't my sanctuary anymore. It was a stage, and I was performing the role of a declining woman for an audience I never auditioned for. 3 days passed before I heard Nick's key again. I was reading in my favorite armchair, the burgundy one Caleb had surprised me with after my first year of teaching, when the front door opened without a knock. The casual invasion made my chest tighten. Morning, Mom, Nick called, his voice artificially cheerful. Behind him, Allison carried a clipboard and wore the expression of someone conducting a home inspection. We brought groceries, she announced, heading straight for my kitchen. I heard her opening cabinets, rearranging things with the confidence of ownership. I followed them, watching as Nick installed something on my landline phone. A small black device I didn't recognize. What is that? I asked. Call monitoring, he said without looking up. So we know if you're getting those scam calls that target elderly people. Elderly. The word stung more than it should have. Yesterday I'd solved the Sunday crossword in record time. This morning I'd balanced my checkbook to the penny. But suddenly I was elderly, vulnerable, incapable of recognizing a telephone scammer. I've been managing my own calls for 67 years, I said. Times change, Mom. Nick's tone suggested the conversation was over. Allison emerged from the kitchen, checking items off her clipboard. Sydney, we need to discuss your spending habits. $300 at the bookstore last month? That seems excessive. The bookstore, where I'd bought gifts for my former students' graduations, where I'd purchased the mystery novels that kept my mind sharp, where I'd found the poetry collection that reminded me of Caleb's favorite verses. Each purchase had been deliberate, meaningful. Those were gifts, I explained. For people who barely remember you exist, Allison said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. We've set up automatic bill pay and a weekly allowance. Much simpler. An allowance. Like I was 12 years old again, asking my father for spending money. That evening I tried calling my friend Martha. The phone made strange clicking sounds before connecting. Sydney, you sound far away, Martha said. The connection's been odd lately, I replied, then caught myself glancing toward the black device. How's your garden? We talked for 20 minutes about safe topics. Weather, neighborhood gossip, her grandson's soccer games. But when I mentioned feeling isolated, the line went quiet for a moment. Are you all right, dear? Martha asked. Before I could answer, I heard another click. The call ended abruptly. When I tried calling back, a recorded message played. This number has been temporarily restricted. Please contact your service provider. My hands shook as I set down the receiver. They were screening my calls now, deciding who deserved access to my voice. The next morning brought new revelations. My credit cards were temporarily suspended for security purposes. My checkbook had mysteriously vanished from the kitchen drawer where I'd kept it for decades. Even my spare car keys, the ones I'd hidden in the flower pot by the front door, were gone. We're just streamlining things, Nick explained when I confronted him. Making your life easier. But nothing felt easier. Everything felt impossible. I stood at my bedroom window, watching Mrs. Patterson tend her roses across the street. She waved and I waved back, wondering if she could see the prisoner behind the glass. That's when I heard them talking downstairs. Their voices carried up through the old heating vents. A quirk of this house that had once allowed me to know when teenage Nick was sneaking in past curfew. By the end of summer, Allison was saying, the lawyer said once she's deemed incompetent, the power of attorney transfer will be automatic. What if she fights it? Nick's voice, smaller, uncertain. She won't. Look at her, she's already questioning herself. A few more weeks of this and she'll be begging us to take over. I sank onto my bed, the words hitting me like physical blows. End of summer. They had a timeline. A plan. I wasn't just losing my independence. I was being systematically dismantled. The heartbreak wasn't in losing control of my bank account or my telephone. It was in realizing that my son, the boy I'd raised to value honesty, kindness, and respect, saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome. Not his mother. Not the woman who'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. Just a liability to be managed until I could be disposed of. Over the following days, I tested myself constantly. Did I remember to take my vitamins? Yes. Could I recall what I'd eaten for breakfast? Scrambled eggs with cheese, wheat toast, coffee with cream. Was I forgetting appointments? No, because I wasn't allowed to make any. But whenever Nick visited, I found myself stumbling over words, losing track of thoughts mid-sentence. The stress of performance was creating the very symptoms they claimed to be protecting me from. See, Nick would say gently, that pitying look in his eyes. It's getting worse, Mom. And I'd begun to believe him. Until I climbed into the attic one afternoon, searching for photo albums I knew they hadn't found yet. Behind a box of Christmas decorations, my fingers brushed against something familiar. Caleb's old voice recorder. The one he'd used for recording lesson plans when he was studying to become a substitute teacher after his retirement. I held the small device in my hands, remembering how Caleb had always said, "Words have power, Sydney. When you can't trust your memory, trust your voice." That night, after the house settled into darkness, I pressed record for the first time. "My name is Sydney Hartwell," I whispered. "Today is June 15th. I'm not confused. I am not incompetent. And I am being systematically erased by my own son." My voice was steady, clear, undeniably lucid. My memory might fail me eventually, but my voice would remember everything. Recording became my ritual. Every morning at dawn, before the house stirred with unwelcome visitors, I whispered my truths into Caleb's old device. Day 3, Nick removed all my address books. Day 7, Allison took my prescription bottles to organize them. Day 12, they're installing security cameras. For my safety, they claim. But on day 15, everything changed when I heard Martha's voice through my bedroom window. Sydney. Sydney, are you home? She called from the front yard, her familiar voice cutting through the morning quiet like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. I rushed downstairs, forgetting caution, desperate for connection with someone who remembered who I used to be. But when I reached for the front door handle, it wouldn't turn. A new deadbolt had appeared overnight, one that required a key from both sides. Martha. I called through the closed door, pressing my palm against the wood. I can't, the lock is. What do you mean you can't open it? Her voice carried concern, not judgment. Through the window, I could see her standing on my porch, wearing the purple cardigan I'd knitted her last Christmas. Her silver hair caught the morning light, and her face showed the same sharp intelligence that had helped her navigate 40 years as a family court judge before retirement. They changed the locks, I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay composed. Martha's expression shifted from confusion to something harder, more dangerous. She walked around to my kitchen window where we'd shared countless cups of coffee over the decades. Who changed them, Sydney? Nick and Allison. They say it's for my protection, but you're locked inside your own home. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades recognizing abuse in all its forms. I nodded, tears threatening. Martha, I need to tell you something. Can you come back tonight? Around 10? They usually leave by then. Her eyes narrowed with understanding. I'll be here. That evening, I watched from my dark living room until Martha's car pulled into my driveway. I'd unlocked the window earlier, praying they hadn't secured those too. The kitchen window slid open with a soft scrape, and Martha climbed through with surprising agility for a 71-year-old woman. This is absolutely ridiculous, she whispered, brushing dirt from her slacks. Sneaking into my best friend's house like teenagers. I handed her the voice recorder without explanation. Her face grew graver with each passing minute as she listened to my documented evidence. When my recorded voice described overhearing their timeline for taking control, Martha's hands clenched into fists. Those calculating little, she caught herself, remembering her manners even in outrage. Sydney, this is elder abuse. Financial exploitation. But what if they're right? What if I am losing my mind? Martha gripped my shoulders, forcing me to meet her eyes. The woman who just orchestrated this secret meeting, who's been systematically documenting evidence for weeks, who solved last Sunday's crossword puzzle in 15 minutes. That woman is not losing her mind. She stayed until midnight and we formed our plan. Martha would mail a cassette tape to her nephew David, who worked in elder law. Meanwhile, she'd contact Robert Chin, Caleb's former attorney, the one who'd helped us draft our wills years ago. But first, she said, we need concrete proof of what they're doing financially. The next morning, I attempted something I hadn't done in weeks. I tried to access my online banking. The computer showed an error message. Account access temporarily restricted. Please contact your branch. My checking account, which I'd managed independently for 42 years, was now controlled by someone else. Martha arrived the following afternoon during Nick's usual absence, armed with information that made my blood run cold. Robert did some digging, she said, spreading documents across my kitchen table. Sydney, they've already submitted paperwork to add Allison as a joint owner on your checking account. They've contacted a real estate agent about listing this house. I stared at the papers, my hands trembling. Without my signature? They're using a preliminary power of attorney document. One that shouldn't be valid yet because you haven't been declared incompetent. But they're betting no one will check too closely. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd imagined possible. Not only were they stealing my present, they were erasing my future. There's more, Martha continued gently. They've scheduled you for another medical evaluation next week. With a doctor who specializes in dementia assessments. Robert thinks they're shopping for a diagnosis. My stomach dropped. They were manufacturing the evidence they needed to justify their theft. What do we do? Martha smiled, the same fierce expression she'd worn in courtrooms when defending vulnerable families. We beat them at their own game. Robert's arranging for you to see Dr. Elizabeth Warner tomorrow. She's one of the most respected neurologists in the state, and she's testified in elder abuse cases before. The next day, Martha drove me to Dr. Warner's office in her ancient Honda, taking back roads to avoid any possibility of being followed. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was sneaking around to prove my own competency. Dr. Warner was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and direct questions. She spent 3 hours with me conducting memory tests, cognitive assessments, and detailed interviews about my daily functioning. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said finally, "you show signs of mild cognitive decline, which is normal for someone your age. Your memory has some gaps, but your reasoning, judgment, and decision-making abilities are completely intact. You are absolutely competent to manage your own affairs." I nearly cried with relief. Not because the news was surprising, but because finally someone with authority was confirming what I'd known all along. Martha squeezed my hand as Dr. Warner continued, "I'm also required to tell you that what you've described, family members restricting your access to your own finances and property without legal authority, constitutes financial abuse under state law." We left the office with official documentation of my competency and Dr. Warner's detailed report. But more importantly, we left with validation that my instincts had been correct. "Now what?" I asked as Martha drove us home. "Now we gather everything we have and let Robert work his magic," she said. "But Sydney, you need to understand, this might get ugly. Nick is going to fight back when he realizes his plan is falling apart." I thought about my son, about the gentle boy who'd once made me Mother's Day cards from construction paper and glue. Then I thought about the man who'd locked me in my own home and plotted to steal my life's work. "I'm not fighting for money," I said quietly. "I'm fighting for my dignity." Martha nodded. "Then we'll make sure you win both." Robert Chin moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd spent 30 years defending people's rights. Within a week of our meeting, papers were filed, and suddenly Nick found himself on the receiving end of legal documents he hadn't expected. "Mom, what is this?" His voice cracked over the phone when the court summons arrived. For the first time in months, he sounded like the uncertain boy I remembered. "It's me taking back my life," I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. The silence stretched between us before he spoke again, his tone shifting to something colder. "You're making a mistake. We're trying to help you, and you're listening to that meddling old woman instead of your own family." That meddling old woman was currently in my kitchen, helping me organize the evidence we'd gathered. Martha looked up from her neat stacks of documents when I hung up the phone. "How did he sound?" she asked. "Scared." The realization gave me no satisfaction. And angry. 2 days later, Nick arrived with his own lawyer, a sharp-suited man named Bradley Winters who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate law firm's advertisement. They sat across from Robert Chin in a sterile conference room, trying to negotiate a settlement that would avoid court entirely. "Mrs. Hartwell clearly needs assistance managing her affairs," Winters said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to intimidating elderly clients. "My client is simply trying to ensure his mother's well-being." Robert slid a folder across the table. "Your client has been systematically isolating his mother, restricting her access to her own property, and attempting to gain control of her assets without proper legal authority. We have documentation." I watched Nick's face as Robert outlined our evidence. The color drained from his cheeks when Robert mentioned the recorded conversations, and his hands clenched when Martha's testimony was discussed. "This is ridiculous," Allison interjected, speaking for the first time. "Sydney's condition is deteriorating. We've seen it firsthand." "Have you?" Robert asked mildly. "Because Dr. Warner's comprehensive evaluation suggests otherwise." That's when I knew we were going to court. Nick's jaw tightened with stubborn determination, the same expression he'd worn as a child when he'd been caught in a lie but refused to admit it. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare. Those 21 days felt like living in a war zone. Nick and Allison increased their visits, documenting every moment I hesitated to find a word, every time I misplaced my reading glasses. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Allison said during one particularly tense visit. "We're not the enemy here." But they were treating me like one. The house felt under siege, every conversation recorded by hidden devices they thought I hadn't noticed, every interaction designed to provoke the confusion they needed to prove their case. Martha practically moved in during those final weeks, helping me practice my testimony and keeping me grounded when anxiety threatened to overwhelm my clarity. "Remember," she said the night before the hearing, "you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for every parent who's ever been betrayed by the child they raised." The morning of the hearing arrived gray and drizzling, as if the weather itself reflected the somber nature of what was about to unfold. I wore my navy blue dress, the one Caleb had always said made me look distinguished, and carried the small leather purse that held my voice recorder. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, but the weight of what would be decided there made it feel enormous. Judge Patricia Holloway presided, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Nick and Allison sat at one table with their lawyer, while Martha, Robert, and I occupied the other. When I caught Nick's eye, he looked away quickly, but not before I saw something that might have been shame. Winters presented their case first, painting a picture of a confused, declining woman who could no longer manage basic tasks. He submitted evidence of my erratic behavior, my attempts to access my own bank account, my paranoid concerns about missing belongings, my inappropriate friendship with Martha. "Mrs. Hartwell requires protection from herself," he concluded, "and from those who would take advantage of her vulnerability." The irony of that statement hung heavy in the air. Then it was Robert's turn. He called Dr. Warner first, who testified about my cognitive abilities with clinical precision. Her words carried weight, but it was the recordings that changed everything. When Robert played the first tape, my clear, articulate voice describing the systematic removal of my belongings, I watched the judge's expression shift. But it was the second recording that sealed our case. Allison's voice, captured through those old heating vents, discussing their timeline for gaining control. "If we play this right, we'll have everything signed over by the end of summer." Her recorded voice filled the courtroom. Nick's face went white. Allison stared straight ahead, her composure cracking for the first time. "She's manipulating you," Nick suddenly shouted, standing up despite his lawyer's restraining hand. "She's playing the victim, but she's the one who's sick." Judge Holloway's gavel came down once, sharp and final. "Mr. Carter, you will sit down and remain silent, or you will be removed from my courtroom." The judge's voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen every form of family dysfunction imaginable. "No, Mr. Carter. After listening to these recordings and reviewing the evidence, it appears your mother remembers quite a bit more than you assumed she would." When the judge delivered her decision, the words seemed to echo in the stunned silence. "Guardianship petition denied." However, given the concerning pattern of behavior demonstrated by the petitioner and his spouse, this court is establishing a protective trust to ensure Mrs. Hartwell's assets remain secure while providing appropriate support for her continued independence. Allison was the first to leave, her heels clicking angrily against the marble floor, her dreams of redecorating my home evaporating with each step. She didn't look back, didn't say goodbye, just walked out of the courtroom and, as I would later learn, out of Nick's life entirely. But Nick remained, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprise, betrayal, perhaps even a grudging respect. "Why would you do this to me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and for a moment I saw both the man who'd tried to steal my life and the boy I'd raised with such hope. "Because I may forget your face one day," I said quietly, "but I'll never forget what you tried to do to me." The truth hung between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. Nick walked out of that courtroom without looking back, and I felt something inside me shift. Not break, but transform. The bridge between us might be damaged, but I was still standing and I had work to do. The first task was reclaiming what had been stolen. Robert Chin accompanied me to my bank the following Monday, where we discovered the extent of their attempted theft. The branch manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, looked genuinely horrified as she scrolled through the unauthorized access attempts. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm so sorry this happened," she said, printing out statements that showed the breadth of their manipulation. "We've restored full access to all your accounts and implemented additional security measures." But I wasn't interested in security measures anymore. I was interested in purpose. That afternoon, Martha and I sat in Robert's office as he spread new documents across his mahogany desk. "Your will, trust, and medical directives," he said. "Clean slate. Who would you like as beneficiaries?" I stared at the blank spaces where Nick's name would have been, feeling an unexpected sense of freedom rather than loss. I want to create something that matters, I said. An education fund for children who need opportunities. The Caleb and Sydney Hartwell Educational Foundation, Martha suggested softly. The name felt right, honoring the man who'd believed education could change the world and the woman who'd spent 4 decades proving him correct. Within 2 weeks, the foundation was established. Robert helped me craft the mission statement, providing educational opportunities for underprivileged children, because every young mind deserves the chance to flourish. The irony wasn't lost on me. The son who'd tried to steal my assets had inadvertently inspired me to give them away to children who would truly appreciate the gift of learning. Martha arrived one morning carrying 3 cardboard boxes I hadn't seen in months. "Your journals," she announced, setting them on my kitchen table. I may have rescued a few things during those early weeks when items kept disappearing. I opened the top box with trembling hands. Inside were notebooks spanning 30 years. My thoughts on teaching, reflections on raising Nick, memories of Caleb, observations about life and literature. My voice, preserved in ink and paper. "You saved them," I whispered. "I had a feeling they might be important someday," Martha said with a knowing smile. As I flipped through pages of my own handwriting, an idea began forming. These weren't just personal memories. They were documentation of a woman's life, proof that age doesn't diminish worth, evidence that mothers remember even when the world tries to erase them. Dr. Sarah Mitchell at the Regional Memory Care Clinic was fascinated when I contacted her about donating copies of my journals. "Mrs. Hartwell, these could be invaluable for families dealing with similar situations," she said during our meeting. "We see financial abuse of elderly parents more often than people realize, but we rarely have such detailed documentation of the emotional manipulation involved." I spent the next month working with Dr. Mitchell to identify the most relevant passages. Moments when I'd questioned my own sanity, instances where I'd documented the gradual erosion of my autonomy, reflections on the difference between genuine care and controlling behavior. "This entry particularly struck me," Dr. Mitchell said, reading from my journal dated 3 weeks before the court hearing. "You wrote, 'Today I remembered that love doesn't require surrender of self. Protection doesn't demand isolation. Care doesn't justify control.' These distinctions could help other families recognize unhealthy dynamics." The journal project led to speaking engagements. Dr. Mitchell invited me to address support groups for caregivers and family members of people with cognitive decline. Standing before these audiences sharing my story, I discovered something unexpected. I wasn't the only mother who'd been silenced in the name of protection. Eleanor Walsh, 73, approached me after one such talk. "My daughter took my credit cards last year," she said quietly. "She said it was because I was buying too many gifts for my grandchildren. But those gifts were the only way I felt connected to them anymore." Her story echoed dozens of others I heard. Adult children making unilateral decisions about their parents' lives, using medical concerns as justification for control, gradually stripping away independence under the guise of care. "We need to do something," Eleanor said. "People need to know this happens." That conversation sparked my next project. I'd taught thousands of students to find their voices through writing. Now I needed to find mine again. Learning voice dictation software at 67 proved challenging, but Martha patiently helped me navigate the technology. My fingers might occasionally betray me, forgetting words or stumbling over keys, but my voice remained strong. Chapter 1. I spoke into the computer microphone. My name is Sydney Hartwell, and this is the story of how I learned the difference between forgetting and being forgotten. The book grew organically, weaving together my personal experience with the stories shared by other women I'd met. Not just my journey, but our collective voice. Mothers, wives, teachers, professionals who'd been reduced to nothing more than problems to be managed. The writing process revealed memories I'd thought were lost, details that emerged with surprising clarity when I stopped fighting to remember and simply let the stories flow. I wrote about Caleb's patient encouragement of my teaching career, about Nick's childhood sweetness, about the moment I realized I was stronger than my diagnosis suggested. Remembering Me, a mother's memoir, took 8 months to complete. Martha served as my unofficial editor, helping me organize chapters and refine passages that felt unclear. "This section about rebuilding your confidence after the hearing," she said one afternoon, pointing to a paragraph on her laptop screen. It's powerful, but I think you could push deeper. What did it feel like to trust your own judgment again? The book became more than memoir. It became a guide for other families navigating similar challenges, a testament to the reality that cognitive changes don't negate a person's fundamental worth or right to dignity. When the first printed copy arrived in the mail, I held it like the precious thing it was. My story, my voice, my legacy, transformed from private pain into public purpose. The dedication page read simply, "For every mother who remembers and for every family learning to listen." On the back cover, a familiar photo smiled up at me, Caleb and me on our wedding day, young and hopeful, surrounded by possibilities we never could have imagined. The same photo Nick had tried to erase now graced thousands of copies, ensuring our love story would outlast any attempt to rewrite it. I may not remember everything perfectly anymore, but I remembered what mattered. My worth wasn't diminished by my diagnosis, my voice deserved to be heard, and my legacy belonged to me to write. 6 months after my book was published, I was arranging flowers from my garden when I heard the familiar sound of Nick's car pulling into my driveway. But this time there was no second car door slamming, no sharp click of Allison's heels on the pavement. Just silence and then a single hesitant knock on my front door. I opened it to find my son standing alone on the porch where he'd once confidently marched in with keys and clipboards. Now he waited for permission to enter his childhood home. "Hello, Mom." His voice carried none of its former authority. He looked thinner, older, with shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there during the court proceedings. "Nick." I stepped aside, allowing him into the living room that had been restored to my vision rather than his sterile efficiency. He stood awkwardly near the couch, hands in his pockets, studying the family photos I'd replaced on the mantelpiece. Pictures of him at various ages, smiling and carefree before ambition and Allison had hardened his features. "Allison left," he said abruptly, as if the words had been burning in his throat. 3 weeks ago. She said I failed. Said I was weak for letting you manipulate me." He laughed bitterly. Funny how she saw manipulation everywhere except in her own actions. I settled into my burgundy chair, the one I'd reclaimed after months of exile from my own comfort. "And what do you see now?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on a photo of the three of us. Him, Caleb, and me, taken during his high school graduation. "I see that I lost my mother long before you might lose your memory." The admission hung between us, raw and honest in a way Nick hadn't been in years. "Why did you come here?" I asked. "To ask for forgiveness." His voice cracked slightly on the word forgiveness, making him sound like the uncertain boy who used to seek my comfort after nightmares. I studied his face, searching for the calculation I'd grown accustomed to seeing there. Instead, I found something that might have been genuine remorse, though I wasn't sure I trusted my ability to distinguish between his real emotions and his performed ones anymore. "Forgiveness doesn't come before truth," I said quietly. "You erased me when I was still here, Nick. You buried me before I was gone." His shoulders sagged as if I'd struck him. I know that now. But I was scared, Mom. The diagnosis, it terrified me. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you gradually, so I convinced myself I was protecting what was left. By stealing it? By controlling it. The honesty in his admission surprised us both. Allison made it seem logical, necessary. She said families who planned ahead were the smart ones. I thought about the woman who'd smiled her way through my systematic dismantling, who'd calculated my worth down to the summer timeline for my erasure. And now I understand that I didn't lose you to dementia. I lost you to my own cowardice. The words carried weight, but I wasn't ready to be moved by them. Trust, once shattered, couldn't be rebuilt with a single conversation, no matter how seemingly sincere. "You can visit," I said finally. "Once a month. Sunday afternoons." Hope flickered in his eyes. "To talk? To rebuild?" "No." I cut him off gently but firmly. "To watch. To see what you tried to destroy." His confusion was evident, but he nodded anyway, desperate for any connection I was willing to offer. The following Sunday he arrived to find my living room transformed into an informal classroom. 5 teenagers from the local community center sat cross-legged on cushions, notebooks in their laps, eyes bright with the particular intensity of young people discovering their own voices. "Today we're talking about the power of personal narrative," I announced, settling into my teaching rhythm for the first time in years. How do we tell our own stories when the world tries to write us off? Nick took a seat in the back corner just as he had during parent-teacher conferences when he was proud of my work. But now he wasn't here as a supportive son. He was here as a witness to what he'd almost silenced. Jasmine, a 17-year-old with fierce intelligence and a scholarship to State University, raised her hand. Mrs. Hartwell, what happens when family members don't believe in your story? I glanced toward Nick before answering. Then you tell it louder with more clarity until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. During that session, I read aloud from one of Caleb's letters, written shortly after Nick's birth, describing his hopes for our son's future. I want him to understand that strength isn't about having power over others, Caleb had written. It's about lifting others up when they're vulnerable. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room, especially Nick, whose face flushed with shame as the teenagers absorbed Caleb's wisdom. These monthly sessions became a ritual of sorts. I taught creative writing, shared stories from my decades in education, and read excerpts from Caleb's letters that painted a picture of the family we'd once been. The teenagers were hungry for these glimpses into authentic adulthood, these examples of how to love without controlling, how to care without consuming. Nick attended every session, growing quieter each time, shrinking into himself as he witnessed the respect and affection these young people showed me, the same respect he'd systematically dismantled. During one particularly moving session, Marcus, a quiet boy who'd never known his grandparents, asked me to read Caleb's letter about teaching Nick to ride a bicycle. Sydney held one side, I held the other. I read in Caleb's familiar cadence. But when Nick was ready to fly, we both had to let go. The hardest part of loving someone isn't holding on, it's knowing when to trust them to soar alone. The room fell silent. In the back corner, I saw Nick wipe his eyes. After the teenagers left, he approached me with something that looked like desperation. That letter, he said. Dad wrote that about teaching me independence. And I used your diagnosis to take yours away. Yes, I said simply. You did. How do I fix this? I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not the calculating man who'd stolen my keys, but the lost boy who'd never learned to process his own fears without trying to control everything around him. You don't fix it, I said. You live with it. You carry the weight of what you did and you let it teach you something about the person you want to become. He nodded slowly, understanding perhaps for the first time that some mistakes don't get erased, they get integrated into who we are. As the months passed, I noticed changes in Nick during his visits. He stopped trying to justify his actions, stopped asking for absolution I wasn't ready to give. Instead, he simply listened, to the teenagers' stories, to Caleb's letters, to the sound of my voice growing stronger with each session. And in that listening, I began to see glimpses of the son I'd raised, the one who'd absorbed his father's lessons about lifting others up rather than holding them down. My memory might fade with time, but the warmth in my chest when I saw those young faces light up with possibility, that feeling would endure. That was where my true revenge lived. Not in punishing Nick, but in nurturing the exact opposite of what he'd tried to destroy. In showing him, and myself, that some legacies are too powerful to erase. If this story of a mother's quiet revenge had you hooked, hit that like button. My favorite part was when Sydney played those voice recordings in court and Nick's face went white. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Subscribe for more incredible stories of justice and resilience. When I asked to join the family jet trip, my in-laws laughed. She should be grateful we let her in the house, she can take a bus. I stayed quiet. They landed in a storm. I touched down in Bora Bora. First class, private and not alone. She should be grateful we let her in the house, she can take a bus. The words hit me like ice water. Cousin Margaret's voice carried across the marble foyer, bouncing off the crystal chandelier above us. The family jet trip to Martha's Vineyard had been planned for months, and somehow I'd foolishly thought, after 2 years of marriage, that I might finally be included. I stood there in my carefully chosen navy dress, the one Anthony had complimented that morning, watching as 23 members of the Whitmore family burst into laughter. The sound echoed through the grand entrance hall like a chorus of mockery, each chuckle another nail in the coffin of my dignity. Anthony's laugh was the loudest. My husband, the man who had promised to love and protect me, threw his head back and laughed at his cousin's joke. About me. About his wife. The woman carrying his child. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing stories about standing up for what's right. If you believe that love and respect should never be conditional on wealth, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women facing similar struggles. Now let's see how this unfolds. The first time I'd stepped into this mansion 3 years ago, I'd felt like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. Everything was too big, too shiny, too intimidating. The marble floors stretched like frozen lakes beneath my feet. Gold-framed portraits of long-dead Whitmores stared down at me with disapproving eyes, as if they could sense I didn't belong in their bloodline. The entrance hall alone was larger than my childhood home. Dual staircases curved upward like arms reaching toward heaven, their mahogany banisters polished to perfection. A chandelier the size of a small car hung overhead, its crystals catching the afternoon light and throwing rainbows across the walls. Everything screamed old money, established power, untouchable status. I had married into wealth, yes, but I'd walked through the service entrance. That first dinner remains burned into my memory. 24 place settings of bone china, silver cutlery that probably cost more than my car, and cloth napkins folded into perfect swans. I'd been seated between Anthony's teenage nephew and the family priest, the conversational equivalent of Siberia. "So, Kristen," Anthony's sister Victoria had said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "Anthony tells us you worked in retail?" The way she said retail made it sound like I'd been cleaning sewers. I'd managed a boutique clothing store actually. Had a degree in fashion merchandising. Built a small but loyal customer base through genuine care and attention to detail. But under Victoria's gaze, my accomplishments shriveled like flowers in winter. "I managed a boutique in the arts district," I'd replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "How quaint," she'd responded, then immediately turned to discuss the family's latest acquisition, a vineyard in Tuscany. Conversations flowed around me like water around a stone. They discussed board meetings I'd never attend, charity galas I'd never be invited to, family vacations that happened without me. I became an expert at nodding politely while feeling completely erased. Anthony's Aunt Millicent was the worst. During my second visit, she'd actually handed me her fur coat when I'd walked into the sitting room. "Be a dear and hang this up properly," she'd said without looking up from her magazine. When I'd stood there, confused, she'd glanced up with irritation. "Well, the coat closet is right there." I'd hung up the coat. Anthony had been in the room. He'd watched the entire exchange while sipping his brandy. When I'd caught his eye, he just shrugged and smiled, that easy, dismissive smile that meant, "Don't make a scene." Later, when I'd brought it up in the car, he'd laughed it off. "She's old-fashioned, Chris. He treats everyone like the help. Don't take it personally." But how could I not take it personally when it happened again and again? When I'd offer to help with dinner preparations and be waved away like an intrusion. When conversations stopped when I entered rooms. When family photos were taken without anyone thinking to include me. The isolation was suffocating. At family gatherings, I'd find myself gravitating toward the edges of rooms, nursing a glass of sparkling water while everyone else drank champagne. I'd learned to smile and nod, to laugh at jokes I didn't understand about people I'd never met, to pretend I wasn't slowly disappearing. Stella was different. Stella Whitmore, the family matriarch at 82, had built this empire alongside her late husband. She was small but commanding, with silver hair always perfectly styled and eyes that missed nothing. While others in the family seemed to look through me, she looked at me. Really looked. During my third visit, she'd noticed me standing alone on the terrace while everyone else mingled inside. She'd approached with 2 cups of tea and sat beside me on the stone bench. "They're overwhelming, aren't they?" she'd said simply. I'm still adjusting," I'd replied carefully. Adjusting to being invisible? The directness had startled me. I'd looked at her, searching for mockery, but found only understanding. "Anthony loves you," she'd continued. "I can see it in the way he looks at you when you're not watching. But love isn't always enough to build a bridge over decades of privilege and assumption." From that day forward, Stella made sure I was included. She'd save the seat beside her at dinner. She'd ask about my day, my thoughts, my dreams. She'd bring me tea when the family gatherings became too much. When I'd started getting migraines from the stress, she'd notice immediately and guide me to a quiet room to rest. She was the only one who noticed when I stopped drinking champagne at family events. The only one who saw my hands trembling when I thought no one was looking. The only one I'd trusted with my secret. 30 days pregnant. After 2 years of trying, countless doctor visits, and the heartbreak of IVF treatments that Anthony had increasingly distanced himself from. The day I'd gotten the positive test, I'd called Stella before I'd even called my husband. "I'm pregnant," I'd whispered into the phone, tears streaming down my face. "Oh, my dear girl," she'd breathed. "Oh, this is wonderful news." She'd been my anchor through the terrifying early weeks. The phone calls to check on my nausea. The reminders to take my vitamins. The gentle questions about how I was feeling emotionally. She'd even offered to come with me to my first official appointment when Anthony had to handle something at the office. So when Margaret's cruel words cut through the air that day, when the family's laughter felt like daggers, I'd instinctively looked for Stella. She was standing near the window, her teacup frozen halfway to her lips. But her expression wasn't shocked or embarrassed like I'd expected. It was furious. I'd never seen Stella angry before. Her face remained composed, but her eyes had turned to ice. She was staring at her family, her legacy, as if seeing them clearly for the first time. The disappointment radiating from her was almost tangible. She set down her teacup with deliberate precision. The small sound seemed to echo in the sudden quiet that followed the laughter. Margaret was still wiping tears from her eyes, delighted with her own cleverness. "How amusing," Stella said, her voice carrying despite its quiet tone. "I wasn't aware we'd become the sort of family that mocks pregnant women." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's smile faltered. Anthony's laughter died in his throat. Everyone turned to stare at me, confusion and calculation flickering across their faces. But Stella wasn't done. She walked across the room with measured steps, her cane tapping against the marble floor like a metronome counting down to judgment. "Kristen," she said, reaching for my hand. "Would you join me in the study? I believe we have some important matters to discuss." As she led me away from the frozen tableau of the family, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, sharp and raw. But underneath it, something else was growing. Something that felt like hope. Or perhaps something that felt like justice. Stella's study felt like a sanctuary compared to the harsh laughter we'd left behind in the foyer. Dark mahogany bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes that actually looked read rather than displayed. A Persian rug covered most of the hardwood floor, and afternoon sunlight filtered through heavy curtains, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. She closed the door with a soft click and gestured toward the burgundy leather armchair beside her desk. I sank into it gratefully, my legs suddenly feeling unsteady. The weight of the morning, of Margaret's cruel words, of Anthony's betraying laughter, of carrying this secret alone, pressed down on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. "Tell me everything," Stella said simply, settling into her own chair behind the desk. "From the beginning." The beginning. Where was that exactly? The first time I'd felt nauseous and blamed it on stress? The morning I'd stared at the pregnancy test with shaking hands? Or was it further back, to the fertility clinic waiting rooms that had become as familiar as my own living room? "It's been almost 2 years, I whispered, my voice barely audible. 2 years of trying, of hoping, of feeling like my body was failing me. Stella leaned forward, her weathered hands folded on the desk. "Anthony." I let out a bitter laugh. Anthony said I was becoming obsessed. That I needed to relax and let nature take its course. Easy words from someone who didn't have to track ovulation cycles or give themselves hormone injections in the bathroom at work. The memories flooded back unbidden. Dr. Martinez explaining that my fallopian tubes showed some scarring from an infection I'd had in college. The cascade of treatments that followed. Pills that made me nauseated, shots that left bruises on my stomach, procedures with cold metal instruments and clinical words that made something as intimate as creating life feel mechanical and sterile. I remember the first appointment Anthony missed, I continued, staring at my hands. It was the consultation for IVF. I sat in that waiting room for 3 hours, watching other couples hold hands and whisper encouragements to each other. When I called him, he said a client meeting had run late. When I got home, I found him playing golf with his college friends. Stella's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. The second missed appointment was worse. It was the egg retrieval procedure. I'd been taking hormone shots for weeks, feeling bloated and emotional and scared. I needed someone there when I woke up. The nurse kept asking where my husband was, and I kept making excuses. My voice cracked. He forgot. He actually forgot. That day remained etched in my memory with painful clarity. Waking up groggy and alone in the recovery room, the nurse's pitying smile, the taxi ride home while feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Anthony had been watching baseball when I'd walked through the door, and his first words had been asking what was for dinner. "I called you that night," I said to Stella. "Do you remember?" I was crying so hard I could barely speak. "I remember," she said softly. "You said you felt invisible." I did. I felt like I was fighting this battle completely alone while my own husband treated it like an inconvenience to his schedule. Stella rose from her chair and moved to the window, her cane tapping softly against the floor. Outside, I could see the landscaped gardens where the family's children often played during gatherings. Children who would grow up with every advantage, never knowing what it was like to beg the universe for the basic gift of motherhood. When the first IVF cycle failed, I continued, Anthony said maybe it was a sign. Maybe we should just accept that children weren't in our future. He suggested we get a dog instead. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Stella turned from the window, her expression fierce. "That's when I offered to help with the second cycle," she said. "Not because I pitied you, but because I recognized something in you that no one else in this family possesses." "What's that?" "The capacity to love something more than yourself." The money had appeared in my account with a simple note. "For the future of our family." $15,000. Stella had made it clear that Anthony was never to know where the funding had come from. When I tried to thank her, she'd waved away my gratitude with characteristic directness. "You don't thank family for investing in family," she'd said. The second IVF cycle had been different because Stella had been present for it. She'd driven me to appointments when Anthony was handling important business. She'd brought thermoses of ginger tea for my nausea and crossword puzzle books to distract me during the long waits. She'd held my hand during the embryo transfer, whispering prayers under her breath. "You know," she'd said during one of those quiet car rides home, "I had 3 miscarriages before Anthony's father was born. People didn't talk about such things back then. You suffered in silence and pretended everything was fine. I used to think that made us stronger. Now I wonder if it just made us lonelier." She'd paused, navigating a turn with careful precision. "You're the only person in this house with a real heart, Kristen. That's why I chose you." At the time I'd thought she meant she'd chosen to help me. Now, sitting in her study with the echo of the family's laughter still ringing in my ears, I was beginning to understand she'd meant something much larger. When the pregnancy test had finally shown 2 pink lines, I'd stared at it for 10 full minutes, afraid to blink in case it disappeared. My hands had shaken so violently I'd nearly dropped the test. After 2 years of negative results, of monthly disappointments that felt like small deaths, seeing those lines had been like watching the sun rise after the longest night of my life. I'd called Stella before I'd even called Anthony. "It worked," I'd whispered into the phone, tears streaming down my face. "Stella, it actually worked." Her silence had stretched so long I'd thought the call had dropped. Then I'd heard her crying soft, gentle sobs that spoke of her own long-held hopes and fears. "Oh, my dear girl," she'd finally managed. "This changes everything. I want to tell Anthony tonight. When he gets home from work. I want it to be special." "Of course you do." Her voice had carried a strange note, something I couldn't identify. "But Kristen, this child will be the first great-grandchild. The heir to everything we've built. That makes you far more powerful than they realize." I hadn't understood what she'd meant then. I'd been too caught up in the joy of finally being pregnant. But over the following weeks, as Anthony's enthusiasm had quickly faded into casual indifference, as the family had continued treating me like an afterthought, Stella's words had begun to make sense. Now, sitting in her study after enduring Margaret's public humiliation, I watched Stella move to her desk and pull out a leather address book. She flipped through pages with purpose, found what she was looking for and reached for the phone. "Ashley." Her voice was crisp, businesslike. "Yes, it's Stella. I need you to come to the house this evening. We have some documents to revise." She paused, listening to the voice on the other end. "All of them," she said firmly. "I'm changing everything. I don't want a single piece of this house in the hands of people who mock love." The conversation continued, but I'd stopped listening. Something was happening. Something bigger than pregnancy announcements or hurt feelings. Stella was making decisions that would reshape everything, and somehow I was at the center of it all. When she hung up, she looked at me with eyes that held both tenderness and steel. Are you ready to stop being invisible, my dear? Before I could answer Stella's question about being ready to stop being invisible, the sound of car tires on gravel echoed through the study windows. Stella glanced at her watch, 10:47 p.m., and smiled with satisfaction. That will be Ashley, she said, rising from her chair with purpose. Always punctual, even at inconvenient hours. I heard the front door open downstairs, followed by the click of heels on marble. No voices, no greetings, just efficient movement. Within minutes, Ashley Montgomery appeared in the doorway of the study, and I understood immediately why Stella had called her. Ashley was everything the Whitmore family pretended to be but wasn't, genuinely powerful. She wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, but it wasn't for show. This was a woman who commanded boardrooms and courtrooms with equal ease. Her silver hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her blue eyes assessed the room with the precision of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. Stella, she said, setting down a black leather briefcase with deliberate care. I came as soon as I could. Thank you, dear. You remember my granddaughter-in-law, Kristen. Ashley's gaze shifted to me, and I felt evaluated in a way that was neither hostile nor friendly, simply thorough. Of course. Congratulations on your pregnancy. I blinked in surprise. How did you? Stella called me 3 weeks ago about updating her medical directives, Ashley explained, pulling out a chair. She mentioned wanting to ensure proper provisions for any future great-grandchildren. I've been preparing preliminary documents ever since. The realization hit me like cold water. Stella hadn't just been planning this conversation, she'd been orchestrating it for weeks. Every gentle question about my doctor appointments, every knowing look when I'd declined wine at dinner, every careful inquiry about Anthony's level of involvement in my pregnancy, it had all been building to this moment. You've been planning this, I said, though it wasn't really a question. I've been hoping for it, Stella corrected. There's a difference. Hope requires faith in people's better nature. Planning assumes it won't surface on its own. Ashley opened her briefcase with practiced efficiency, revealing neat stacks of documents, a digital recorder and several fountain pens arranged in precise order. Before we begin, I need to confirm your mental capacity and decision-making ability for the record. What followed was a brief but thorough examination. Ashley asked Stella to recite her full name, the date, the address of the property, and the names of her immediate family members. She inquired about current events, recent conversations, and medical treatments. Stella answered each question with sharp clarity, occasionally adding sardonic commentary about her relatives that made Ashley's mouth twitch with suppressed amusement. Satisfied? Stella asked when the questioning concluded. More than satisfied. Your mind is sharper than most people half your age. Ashley pressed a button on the small recorder. This is Ashley Montgomery, attorney at law, conducting a will modification session with Stella Patricia Whitmore on March 15th. Mrs. Whitmore, please state your intentions clearly for the record. I watched, mesmerized, as Stella transformed before my eyes. Gone was the gentle grandmother who brought me tea and asked about my day. In her place sat a woman who had built an empire alongside her husband, who had made decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars. I am of sound mind and body, Stella began, her voice carrying absolute authority. I wish to make comprehensive changes to my last will and testament, dated October 3rd of last year. Ashley's pen moved across legal documents with swift precision. Please specify the nature of these changes. All real estate properties, including the primary residence, the lake house, and the commercial holdings in downtown, are to be transferred into a trust for my great-grandchild, the child currently carried by Kristen Whitmore. I felt the air leave my lungs. The primary residence alone was worth millions. The downtown commercial properties generated enough rental income to support a lavish lifestyle indefinitely. All stock portfolios, investment accounts, and business interests are to be similarly transferred, Stella continued without pause. The child's mother, Kristen, will serve as trustee until the child reaches majority, with full authority to make decisions regarding the properties and investments. Stella, I whispered, finding my voice. This is too much. I can't. She held up one hand, stopping my protest. The current beneficiaries, My son Robert, my daughter-in-law Patricia, my grandson Anthony, and my granddaughters Victoria and Margaret will receive a token inheritance of $10,000 each. Enough to cover funeral expenses and a nice vacation, but nothing more. Ashley's pen never stopped moving. She'd clearly handled dramatic inheritance changes before, though I suspected few had been quite this comprehensive. Any specific conditions or restrictions? Yes. Should Kristen divorce Anthony, she retains full control of the trust. Should Anthony attempt to claim any portion of the inheritance through marriage rights, the entire estate will be donated to the Children's Hospital Foundation. My hands were shaking now. The magnitude of what Stella was doing began to sink in. She wasn't just changing her will, she was completely restructuring the family's power dynamic. Anthony's parents, who had always treated me like an unwelcome addition to their social circle, would suddenly find themselves financially dependent on their son's wife. The same wife they'd spent 3 years dismissing and humiliating. "There's more," Stella said, and Ashley looked up with raised eyebrows. "I want a clause stating that any family member who contests this will forfeit their token inheritance entirely. And I want it noted that this decision was made in response to the family's treatment of my granddaughter-in-law, specifically their exclusion of a pregnant family member from a leisure trip." "Stella," I managed to say, "you don't have to do this because of what happened today. They were just being thoughtless." "Thoughtless?" Her voice sharpened. "Kristen, I've watched them treat you like hired help for 3 years. I've seen Anthony ignore your needs, dismiss your feelings, and prioritize his family's approval over his wife's dignity. Today wasn't an isolated incident. It was simply the most public example of a pattern I've been observing since the day you married into this family." Ashley finished writing and looked up. "These are significant changes, Stella. Are you certain this reflects your true wishes?" "More certain than I've been about anything in years." Stella's voice softened slightly. "Ashley, you've known me for 40 years. Have you ever seen me act impulsively?" "Never." "Then trust that this decision comes from careful observation and deep consideration." Stella turned to look at me directly. "Kristen, you gave me something no one else in this family has. Genuine affection without expectation of reward. You visited when you didn't have to, listened to my stories about your grandfather-in-law, and treated me like a person rather than a walking inheritance. More importantly, you're carrying the future of our family name. That child deserves to grow up with resources and security, guided by someone who understands the value of both." Ashley gathered the signed documents into a neat stack. "I'll file these with the probate court first thing Monday morning. They'll become public record within 48 hours. "Good," Stella said with satisfaction. "I want there to be no question about the legitimacy of these changes." As Ashley packed her briefcase preparing to leave, she paused to look at me again. "Mrs. Whitmore, I should inform you that this inheritance comes with significant responsibilities. Managing this level of wealth requires careful planning and professional guidance." "I know," I said quietly. "I'm not sure I'm ready for it." "No one ever is," Stella said gently. "But readiness isn't the same as worthiness. You'll learn, just as I did when your grandfather-in-law died and left me in charge of everything." After Ashley left, Stella and I sat in comfortable silence, listening to the grandfather clock in the corner tick away the minutes. The weight of what had just happened hung between us, not oppressive but significant. "Are you angry with me?" Stella asked finally. "No," I replied, surprised to realize it was true. "I'm terrified but not angry." "Good. Fear keeps you sharp. Complacency makes you vulnerable." Outside, I could hear the distant sound of the family's laughter as they finalized preparations for their morning departure. None of them had any idea that their world had just fundamentally shifted. "When will you tell them?" I asked. Stella smiled, her expression that was both grandmotherly and predatory. "I won't. They'll find out when everyone else does." The morning departure was a spectacle of privilege and entitlement. I watched from the study window as 3 black town cars pulled up to the circular drive, their engines purring like satisfied cats. The family emerged from the house in waves. Louis Vuitton luggage, designer sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and that particular energy that comes from people who've never been told no. Anthony looked handsome in his navy blazer, the one I'd helped him pick out for our anniversary last year. He was laughing at something his sister Victoria had said, his head thrown back in genuine amusement. It was the same laugh I'd fallen in love with 5 years ago, before I'd learned it could be turned into a weapon. "Look at them," Stella murmured from beside me. "Not a care in the world." Margaret was the loudest, as usual, directing the loading of luggage with the authority of someone who'd never carried her own suitcase. "Make sure the wine cases go in the temperature-controlled compartment," she called to the driver. That Bordeaux cost more than most people's cars. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a woman who'd mocked me for needing to take a bus, now obsessing over wine bottles that could fund a small business. Anthony's parents, Robert and Patricia, emerged last, dressed in matching cream-colored outfits that screamed, "We summer in the Hamptons." Patricia was checking her phone with the frantic energy of someone addicted to social media validation, while Robert adjusted his golf cap with the precision of a man who treated every public appearance as a photo opportunity. "Kristen should have come," I heard Victoria say as she climbed into the middle car. "She could have helped carry our beach bags." More laughter. Always more laughter at my expense. My phone buzzed against the windowsill, a weather alert that made my blood run cold. Severe thunderstorm warning. Private aircraft grounded until further notice. Lightning strikes reported at regional airport. All flights suspended. I showed the alert to Stella, who read it with the satisfaction of someone who'd been expecting exactly this news. "How did you know?" I whispered. "I didn't know," she replied, settling back into her chair with her teacup. I hoped. Sometimes the universe has a sense of timing that humans lack. The cars disappeared down the winding driveway, carrying their precious cargo toward what they assumed would be a perfect weekend of sailing, spa treatments and social networking. None of them had checked the weather. Why would they? When you're wealthy enough, you assume the world bends to accommodate your schedule. But nature, it seemed, had other plans. By noon my phone was buzzing with increasingly frantic text messages. "Anthony, 12:47 p.m. Flight delayed. Weather issues. Might be here a few hours." "Anthony, 2:23 p.m. Still waiting. This is ridiculous. The pilot says it could be all day." "Anthony, 4:15 p.m. Phone service is spotty. If you don't hear from me, we're stuck at this airfield in the middle of nowhere." I showed the messages to Stella, who was working on a crossword puzzle with the focus of someone solving international crises. 7 letters, she mused. Deserved consequences. Starts with K. "Karma," I said without thinking. "Perfect." Her pen moved across the squares with satisfaction. By evening the storm had intensified. Through the study windows, we watched lightning illuminate the sky in jagged silver streaks. Rain hammered against the glass with the persistence of an unwelcome visitor, and the wind howled through the oak trees like something wild and angry. I imagined the family huddled in some cramped waiting area, their designer clothes wrinkled, their perfectly styled hair losing its battle against humidity. No 5-star accommodations, no staff to cater to their every whim. Just uncomfortable chairs, vending machine coffee, and each other's company. "Do you think they're worried about us?" I asked Stella. She looked up from her puzzle. "Are you worried about them?" The honesty of my answer surprised me. "No, I'm not." That's when my phone rang with a call from Ashley. "It's done," she said without preamble. The documents were filed at 3 p.m. Public records updated an hour ago. By morning, every financial institution, board member and business partner will have been notified. Stella gestured for me to put the call on speaker. "Any complications?" Stella asked. "None. Your medical evaluations were comprehensive, the witnesses were beyond reproach, and the legal language is airtight. Even if they wanted to contest it, they'd have no grounds." I felt dizzy suddenly. While the family was trapped at an airfield, their entire world had been legally dismantled and rebuilt around my unborn child. They had no idea that every minute they spent complaining about delayed flights was another minute they remained unaware of their new reality. "There's something else," Ashley continued. "A reporter from the Business Journal called my office an hour ago. Someone leaked information about the will change." Stella's eyebrows rose. Leaked. These kinds of inheritance modifications always generate gossip in legal circles, especially when they involve this level of wealth transfer. "I suspect we'll see news coverage by tomorrow." After Ashley hung up, Stella and I sat in contemplative silence. The storm outside seemed to be building rather than dissipating, And I found myself wondering if the family would be forced to spend the night at the airfield. The thought should have made me feel guilty, but instead I felt something closer to poetic justice. "Stella," I said quietly, "what happens when they find out?" "They'll be angry. They'll feel betrayed. They'll blame you, of course." "And Anthony?" She considered this carefully. "Anthony will have to choose. For the first time in his life, he'll face a decision where his family's approval and his own interests are in direct conflict." The baby moved inside me then. A flutter so subtle I might have imagined it, except for the way it made my breath catch. I pressed my hand to my stomach, marveling at the tiny life that had somehow become the center of this family's universe. "I felt that," I whispered. Stella's entire expression softened. "The first movement?" "I think so. It was like a butterfly landing." She reached over and placed her weathered hand over mine. "That child is going to inherit more than money, you know. They'll inherit the responsibility of rebuilding something that was broken. That's not a burden, it's a gift." My phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert from a business website. Whitmore fortune transferred to unborn heir in shocking will revision. The story was already public. While the family sat stranded and disconnected from the world was learning about their downfall. Stella read the alert over my shoulder and nodded with satisfaction. "Perfect timing. They'll land tomorrow to discover that everyone already knows what they're just finding out." Thunder crashed overhead so loud it shook the windows. In the distance I could see emergency vehicles with flashing lights, probably dealing with downed power lines or flooded roads. The storm was affecting everyone, but somehow it felt personal. Like nature itself was ensuring the family remained isolated until justice had run its course. "Do you think this makes us terrible people?" I asked. Stella was quiet for a long moment, watching the lightning dance across the sky. "I think," she said finally, "that terrible people rarely ask that question." The silence that followed my question about being terrible people stretched until dawn. Stella had fallen asleep in her chair sometime after midnight, her crossword puzzle still balanced on her lap, pen clutched loosely in her fingers. I'd covered her with a throw blanket and spent the rest of the night watching the storm gradually exhaust itself against the windows. When my phone rang at 6:23 a.m., I knew before answering that the reckoning had begun. "Kristen." Anthony's voice was raw, hoarse from what sounded like hours of shouting. "What the hell did you do?" I stepped out onto the terrace so I wouldn't wake Stella. The morning air smelled of rain and broken branches, and the gardens were littered with debris from the storm. It felt appropriate, like the landscape was reflecting what was about to happen to the family. "I haven't done anything, Anthony. Don't lie to me." The desperation in his voice was almost frightening. "The will, grandmother's will. Did you know about this? Did you plan this?" "Lower your voice," I said calmly. "You're screaming." "I'm screaming because my family just lost everything. Because somehow my pregnant wife is now worth more than all of us combined. Because I just spent 14 hours trapped in an airport watching my mother have a nervous breakdown while reporters called asking for statements about the Whitmore inheritance scandal." I found myself oddly detached from his panic. 3 months ago his distress would have sent me running to comfort him. Now I felt like I was watching a stranger fall apart. "Where are you?" I asked. "I'm at the house. Or what used to be our house before you and grandmother decided to steal it from my family." "It was never your house, Anthony. It was Stella's house. She can do whatever she wants with her own property." The line went quiet for so long I thought he'd hung up. When he spoke again his voice was different. Smaller, more confused than angry. "How long have you known?" "Known what?" "That she was going to do this. That you were going to inherit everything." I thought about lying, about protecting him from the full truth. But we were past the point of gentle deceptions. "I found out the night before you left for Martha's Vineyard," I said. "When your cousin Margaret suggested I take the bus because I should be grateful you people let me in the house at all." Another silence. "Then, that's why you're doing this?" "Because of something Margaret said." The question revealed everything wrong with Anthony's understanding of our marriage, our family, our entire relationship. He genuinely believed this was about one insult, one moment of thoughtlessness. He couldn't see the pattern of dismissal and contempt that had defined my entire experience with his family. "This isn't about Margaret," I said quietly. "This is about you laughing when she said it." I hung up before he could respond. Within an hour, cars began arriving at the mansion. I watched from the terrace as Anthony's parents pulled up in their silver Mercedes, followed by Victoria's red BMW, then Margaret's white Range Rover. One by one, the family members who had been so eager to escape on their luxury vacation came crawling back to confront their new reality. But Stella was gone. She'd left before sunrise, taking only a small suitcase and her jewelry box. I'd helped her load her car in the pre-dawn darkness, both of us moving with the quiet efficiency of people executing a well-planned escape. "Where will you go?" I'd asked. "The lake house," she'd replied. "It's smaller, quieter. More appropriate for an old woman who just wants to read her books and tend her garden." "The lake house that's now technically mine?" She'd smiled at that. "Technically your child's. I trust you'll let an old woman live there in peace." Now, watching her former family pound on the door of an empty mansion, I understood the strategic brilliance of her departure. She had no interest in facing their anger, their accusations, their desperate attempts at manipulation. She'd made her decision, executed it perfectly, and removed herself from the aftermath. The pounding grew more insistent. Through the windows, I could see Patricia's face pressed against the glass, her perfect makeup smeared from crying. Robert was on his phone, probably calling lawyers, while Victoria and Margaret stood arguing in the driveway. My phone buzzed with a text from Ashley. "Legal challenge filed this morning. Dismissed this afternoon. They hired 3 different law firms. None will touch it." I wasn't surprised. Ashley had spent 40 years building her reputation on cases exactly like this. Wealthy families destroying themselves over money. She'd seen every trick, every loophole, every desperate attempt to overturn an ironclad will. The family's business empire began crumbling within days. Stella had been more than just the family matriarch. She'd been the financial backbone, the co-signer on credit lines, the trusted name that opened doors and secured favorable terms. When news broke that she'd transferred her entire estate to an unborn child, confidence evaporated overnight. I learned about the collapse through news reports rather than family communication. The Whitmore Group's stock price plummeted. Vendors demanded immediate payment on outstanding invoices. Banks called in loans that had been automatically renewed for decades. "Whitmore Empire in free fall following inheritance shock," read one headline. "From riches to rags, how one will changed everything," declared another. The media coverage was merciless. Business journalists dissected the family's financial structure with surgical precision, revealing how dependent they'd been on Stella's backing. Society reporters whispered about family dysfunction and public humiliation. Social media buzzed with speculation about the mysterious pregnant granddaughter-in-law who'd somehow orchestrated the entire downfall. I wasn't orchestrating anything. I was simply watching it unfold from my small apartment across town, one hand protectively covering my growing belly, trying to process the magnitude of what my child would inherit, and the cost of that inheritance. Anthony appeared at my door on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after their disastrous return. He looked terrible. Unshaven, rumpled, wearing the same shirt I'd seen him in 2 days earlier on a news broadcast about the family's financial troubles. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying the man I'd married. The confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked like grief. His usual easy smile had been replaced by lines of worry and exhaustion. "5 minutes," I said, stepping aside. He sat heavily on my small sofa. The same sofa he'd once joked was charmingly modest compared to the furniture in his family home. Now it probably looked like luxury compared to what he could afford. "I've been thinking," he said, not meeting my eyes. "About what you said. About me laughing." I waited. "I did laugh," he continued. "I laughed because that's what I've always done. When my family makes their little jokes, I laugh along. It's easier than confronting them, easier than making waves. Easier than defending your wife." He looked up then, and I saw something I'd never seen before in his eyes: genuine shame. "I failed you," he said simply. "I failed you as a husband, and I'm going to fail our child as a father. I've spent my whole life being afraid of my own family, and now I don't even know who I am without their approval." The honesty was startling. For 3 years, I'd waited for Anthony to acknowledge what his silence had cost our marriage. Now that he had, I realized it was too late to matter. "I miss you," he whispered. "I know," I replied. but missing someone doesn't undo the damage. Anthony left that night without saying goodbye. I watched from my window as he sat in his car for nearly 20 minutes, engine running, probably working up the courage to knock on my door again. He never did. The red taillights disappeared around the corner, and somehow I knew it was the last time I'd see him as anything other than a stranger who happened to share my last name. 3 days later, Stella called. "I'm tired of this big house," she said without preamble. "All these empty rooms echoing with old arguments. I'm thinking of the lake cottage. Remember it?" I did remember. We'd visited once during my second year of marriage, a small cedar shake house tucked between tall pines on the quiet side of the lake. It had felt like a fairy tale then, all stone fireplaces and built-in bookshelves, with a wraparound porch that faced the water. Anthony had called it rustic with barely concealed disdain, but I'd fallen in love with its simplicity. "You want to move there?" I asked. "I want us to move there." The offer hung in the air like morning mist. Moving in with my estranged husband's grandmother while carrying his child, it should have felt inappropriate, complicated, wrong. Instead it felt like coming home. "Are you sure?" I whispered. "I'm 82 years old, Kristen. I don't waste time on things I'm unsure about." We moved on a Tuesday in October, when the leaves were turning and the air smelled of wood smoke and possibility. Stella had already arranged for movers to bring only the essentials: her favorite reading chair, boxes of photo albums, the antique rocking chair where she'd nursed her own children decades ago. Everything else stayed behind with the mansion, like artifacts of a life she no longer wanted to claim. The cottage felt different than I remembered. Smaller, cozier, more intimate. Morning sunlight streamed through gauze curtains and the floors creaked pleasantly underfoot. Stella had already stocked the pantry with herbal teas and the kind of crackers that settled an uneasy stomach. "The baby likes it here," she announced after watching me eat breakfast without rushing to the bathroom for the first time in weeks. He was right. The constant nausea that had plagued my first trimester seemed to ease in the peaceful rhythm of lake life. Stella and I developed routines that felt natural rather than forced. Morning tea on the porch, afternoon walks along the shoreline, evenings by the fireplace with books and quiet conversation. It was during one of those evening talks that she brought out the journal. "I've been thinking about what this child should know," she said, settling into her reading chair with a leather-bound notebook. "Not the sanitized family history they teach in private schools, but the real story. The struggles, the mistakes, the lessons learned too late." She opened the journal to reveal pages covered in her precise handwriting. Stories about her husband's humble beginnings as a carpenter's son, about the years they'd scraped and saved to buy their first property, about the business deals that failed before the ones that succeeded. "Your great-great-grandfather was an immigrant," she read aloud. "He came to this country with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable belief that hard work could build anything. He would have been horrified to see what his descendants became, people who inherited wealth but never learned to create it." Night after night she added new entries. Stories about the Great Depression, when the family had lost nearly everything and rebuilt from scratch. About her own mother who had started a small bakery to keep food on the table. About the values that had been forgotten as the family grew more comfortable, more insulated, more convinced of their own superiority. "Your turn," she said one evening, sliding the journal across the coffee table. "I don't know what to write." "Write about what you want this child to know about you. About love. About choosing kindness over cruelty." My first entry was shaky, uncertain. I wrote about growing up in a small apartment where love was abundant even when money wasn't. About my mother who had worked 2 jobs to put me through college and never once complained. About learning that true strength wasn't about having power over others, but about lifting others up when they needed it most. The entries became a nightly ritual. Sometimes Stella would read passages aloud, her voice carrying the weight of decades. Sometimes I would write while she knitted, the clicking of her needles providing a soothing rhythm. The journal grew thicker, more personal, more precious. Winter settled over the lake like a soft gray blanket. Snow muffled the sounds of the outside world, creating a cocoon of peace around our small cottage. My belly grew rounder, and the baby became more active, as if responding to the calm environment we'd created. The family's silence was deafening in its completeness. No phone calls, no letters, no attempts at reconciliation. It was as if we'd simply ceased to exist in their world. Part of me had expected Anthony's mother to reach out, perhaps out of curiosity about her future grandchild. But as weeks turned to months, I realized they'd made their choice. Pride was more important than family. Image was more valuable than love. Stella seemed unsurprised by their absence. "They'll blame you for everything," she said matter-of-factly during one of our morning conversations. "It's easier than admitting they drove away the one person who could have brought them joy." Spring arrived with surprising gentleness. The ice on the lake cracked and melted, revealing dark water that reflected the budding trees. Stella planted a garden behind the cottage. Not the formal arrangements of the mansion, but wild, joyful chaos of vegetables and flowers mixed together. "Every child should know where food comes from," she explained, her hands already dirty from the soil. "Should understand that good things require patience and care." The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday in April, delivered by a courier who seemed apologetic about disturbing our peaceful morning. I signed them at the kitchen table while Stella made pancakes, the domestic normalcy making the legal dissolution feel almost anticlimactic. Anthony hadn't contested anything. No fight over assets we'd never really shared. No battle over custody arrangements for a child he'd never expressed interest in meeting. Just clean, simple documentation that reduced 3 years of marriage to a few paragraphs of legal language. "How do you feel?" Stella asked after the courier left. I considered the question seriously. "Free," I said finally. "Sad but free." She nodded as if this was the answer she'd expected. "Sadness passes. Freedom endures." The day Elise was born was the first warm day of summer. I'd been having contractions since dawn, and Stella had timed them with the precision of someone who'd done this before. We drove to the hospital in comfortable silence, the windows down and the scent of honeysuckle filling the car. Elise arrived just after sunset, small and perfect and furiously angry about being displaced from her warm, dark world. When the doctor placed her in my arms, I felt a shift in the universe, not dramatic but profound. Everything that had come before led to this moment. Every hurt, every betrayal, every difficult choice had been worthwhile because they'd brought me here to her. Stella cried when she held her great-granddaughter for the first time. Real tears, the kind that come from joy too big for words. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Later that night, as I nursed Elise by the window overlooking the lake, Stella added a new entry to the journal. "Today the real inheritance began," she read aloud as she wrote. "Not money or property but love passed down through generations. This child will know she is cherished not for what she owns, but for who she is." Outside, fireflies began their nightly dance over the water, and I realized that this quiet cottage, this peaceful lake, this fierce, loving woman who had chosen to rebuild her legacy around kindness, this was what wealth really looked like. If this story of justice and family betrayal had you holding your breath, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Stella calmly rewrote her will while the family laughed at Kristen, having no idea their world was about to change forever. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.